both within the country and across its borders. So today I'm joined by 4 distinguished speakers, each of whom brings a unique perspective on the situation in Sudan. Together we will examine the ongoing crisis and explore potential avenues for justice and accountability. So I will give the floor to Oscar Rickett. He is a journalist of the Middle East Eyes who has extensively reported on Sudan, including recent investigations into drone strikes that reveal escalating violence on the ground. So, Mr. Oscar Rickett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thierry. Is this on?
You are. The red button.
No, it's a red button.
Yeah.
Yes,
Hi.
Yeah.
You want to hear me? Right, great. Thank you, Thierry, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a journalist, and I've been covering Sudan for a long time, but particularly since 2019. As is typical of journalists, I'm going to give a very general, sweeping talk that sort of introduces you to the war and to some of the main issues, including the involvement of international activism, and I'll be handing over to people who have more in-depth knowledge than I do. So in 2019, a democratic uprising in Sudan toppled Omar al-Bashir, an autocrat who had ruled the country for 3 decades, and who in the first decade of the 21st century presided over a genocide in the vast western region of Darfur. To quell rebellion in Darfur, Bashir had deployed a collection of militias known as the Janjaweed, the devils on horseback, Arab groups who targeted the mostly black African Sudanese who had been protesting his rule and calling for more of their own rights. In 2013, threatened again by protests against his rule and worried that he would be deposed by another military commander, Bashir brought the Janjaweed into the auspices of the state under the intelligence services, and he renamed them the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, a paramilitary group. The commander of the RSF was a Janjaweed warlord named Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known to one and all as Hemeti. Bashir would pronounce his name so that in Arabic it would translate as my protection. And Hemeti, who himself was from Darfur, whose family had origins in Chad, was an outsider, and he built up a large fighting force. 40,000 of these young men went in 2016 to fight in Yemen for the Emirati and Saudi-led coalition. At the same time, the Dagalo family was exporting gold from its mines in Darfur to the markets of Dubai. After Bashir left power in 2019, a transitional civilian military government led Sudan until October 2021, when Hemeti and Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the head of the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, the National Army, enacted a military coup. The RSF and the army had different sources of power and different views of the world, so it was an uneasy alliance. Hemeti was close to the UAE, and its leaders, Burhan, who had been to military academy in Egypt, was closer to the Egyptians. The army had the Sudanese military industrial complex, a string of factories across the country manufacturing pharmaceuticals. The RSF had mercenaries, gold, Captagon, other illicit substances. And these two men, not only do they have different domestic sources of wealth, but they also develop sort of parallel foreign policies, in some cases developing different parts of the same country's diplomatic institutions. So, for example, Bahan would be closer to, became quite close to Benjamin Netanyahu, whereas Hemeti was developing contacts with the Mossad. And a similar story was happening in Russia and in other countries. Attempts by the US and others to return Sudan to civilian rule fell by the wayside in 2023, particularly over the role the RSF would play in a future Sudan. The desire was to return the RSF, either to get rid of it or to reincorporate it into the army. This is not something that the RSF's leaders wanted. In the early hours of the 15th of April 2023, RSF fighters stormed the presidential palace in Khartoum, with Bahan taking up arms himself and escaping into a network of tunnels. The war has continued ever since. And as Thierry said, we're now at a point where over 12 million people have fled their homes. And the leaders of charities, aid agencies have told me that while we can't be sure how many people have died, it's most likely in the hundreds of thousands. The RSF, at the beginning of the war, took Khartoum and its twin cities, but this year the army has made significant gains. It's taken back the capital. And now we're in a situation where the RSF is more or less consigned to Darfur, most of which it controls. It's in Darfur that the RSF has once again been accused of genocide, targeting non-Arab groups, particularly the black Masalit people. And in January, the US government made this designation. They said that the RSF was committing genocide while also determining that the army had committed war crimes, and most recently, it has accused the army of using chemical weapons against the RSF. The war has continued in part, or perhaps mainly, because of the involvement of international actors, primarily the United Arab Emirates, which has supplied the RSF with weapons through a shifting network of supply lines that has at different points included the forces of Khalifa Haftar in eastern Libya, Central African Republic, Chad, Uganda, and now the port of Bosaso in Somalia's Puntland region. The UAE has continued to deny this, but the UN has found reports of Emirati involvement to be credible. In December 2024, the Biden administration's outgoing Middle East advisor, Brendan Girk, told Senator Chris Van Hollen that the UAE had agreed to stop supplying the RSF, which in itself was an admission that it had been supplying the RSF. In January, Van Hollen released a statement saying that this had not, in fact, happened. We now have reports, credible reports, backed up by documentary evidence of the shipment of Chinese-made drones and other military supplies to Niala in Darfur, and it is these shipments that have brought us to a new point in the war. The war is morphing into a drone war. In May, the army, at the beginning of May, the army targeted military cargo flying into Niala, killed civilians in the process, and also, it is alleged, killed Emirati personnel working on the ground there. That set in a chain of events that then saw a drone bombing campaign conducted in retribution on Port Sudan, which has become the de facto capital of Sudan and is a home to the to the Sudanese Armed Forces-led government. That drone campaign caused widespread damage to the city, and it also exposed the involvement of Turkish drone operators who had been working for the Sudanese Armed Forces. So the war has now become more clearly a proxy war that involves not just the UAE but Turkey, and there are credible reports of Qatari involvement, and also there are historic allegiances and alliances between Egypt and the Sudanese army. Diplomatically, attempts to end the war have gone nowhere, and now we face a situation where the war continues to happen, and there appears to be no real pathway to ending it. Hemeti is said to not want to give up the capital Khartoum for the RSF. So having given that overview of what's happening, I'm going to hand over to Matthew Hedges, who will speak more specifically about the UAE's involvement and, well, about whatever he wants to speak about.
So, thank you for your presentation. So now, as you said, I will give the floor to the Dr. Matthew Hedges. He's a British academic specializing in security studies, with a particular focus on authoritarian regime, and will assist in understanding the international dimension of the conflict. So, Dr. Hedges, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending. My academic background is I wrote a doctorate examining the Abu Dhabi ruling family's regime security strategy. I was detained and sentenced to life imprisonment in the UAE, was tortured for the false charge of espionage. As a result, I have a unique understanding of what truly is going on within the UAE, and also what they are doing internationally. The UAE's approach to statecraft, to foreign policy, it follows a very key similar pattern of engagement. Across weak and fragile states, such as Libya, such as Somalia, such as Sudan, such as Yemen, the UAE seeks to pursue a policy of divide and conquer by enabling its own proxy security forces and uprooting society to reshape it in its own image. This is at its core driven by a demand for authority, for control. There is no tolerance for any opposing views, for any opposing sentiment. This is a key indicator as to how and why the UAE is so sensitive in regards to any form of criticism, why it's so sensitive in any form of condemnation or evidence highlighting its activities in war zones, in genocides such as Sudan. It's crucial to state that the UAE's actions in Sudan, alongside the RSF, in enabling the civil war to continue, these are a direct mirroring of what it does domestically. We've seen the UAE co-opt, and we've seen the UAE repress civilians, local populations in this regard in Sudan, in neighboring countries, where they're able to try and establish interest groups, interest networks through criminal, through public, and predominantly security-orientated groups, by enabling these actors to pursue Abu Dhabi's interests. They are extending their reach into these weak and fragile states. Alternatively, if people don't agree with what they want, there's the act of repression. It is enabling these forces to leverage whatever tools they have at their disposal. The UAE has a state security organization, a secret police within its own country, whose laws supersede the national constitution, where there's no protection, there's no accountability or oversight from this. And these are the same sorts of groups that the UAE is supporting in a place like Sudan, where a genocide is occurring. It's always able to demonstrate and legitimize its actions in a broken state by saying, we are here to drive security, we are here to try and defeat extremism, to try and defeat terrorism, which all legitimate qualms, they're all legitimate concerns. But it also distracts away from the actions that they're taking. What we've seen the UAE do, or at least facilitate over the past several years, are arms and weapon shipments increasingly traverse through the UAE, through its international logistics points, such as in Basaso, such as in Uganda, in Kenya, Egypt, Libya, Chad, where these military cargo planes that are coming from parts of the former Soviet Union, from parts of the UAE themselves, these are what are enabling this war to continue. We've seen documented evidence, not just from the UN, but also from the US, of what this entails. Again, as Oscar said, the UAE denies this, but on times there have been documentation of Emirati branded weaponry turning up in the country. It's either that the UAE itself doesn't have full control and autonomy of its own military and security equipment, or it is directly aiding and facilitating this. The UAE is also increasingly looking to work again with partners such as Russia, where through assets in Libya, the UAE has been able to substantially increase the reach of General Haftar. And what we saw last week was that Libyan forces have now reached the Sudanese border, forcing the Sudanese army to retreat. And it has enabled the RSF to have that direct logistic access and control through Libya. These cargo flights are coming into Russian-held military facilities, and from there they're able to now travel into Libya. A similar occurrence occurs in Chad. Similarly, in Central African Republic, Uganda, as I said, in Somaliland. But this is all happening because of the lack of broader interest, or it's happening for the lack of scrutiny. As I said, the UAE is extremely sensitive towards any actions that may identify, that may support the attribution of its activities. But that lack of courage in highlighting this is exactly why these activities are continuing. The UAE has started to lose a considerable amount of momentum, of control, of reach in a country like Sudan. And what we've seen in this regard, and what we've seen in Libya, what we see in Yemen, what we see in Somalia, is instead of possibly accepting that conditions are not in their favor anymore, they are in fact doubling down on their activity. They are increasing the delivery of military support to these proxy groups. They are using and they are they are being rewarded by the spread of conflict from Sudan into its bordering states. They are thriving on this chaos to further legitimize and to further empower their interests. If this were to spill over, if the Sudanese military were to attack these refugee sites in South Sudan, in Chad, where these military weapons and these connections are going through, this would distract away from what they are doing. And it's of course benefiting other states such as Russia, such as Kenya, who, according to a report recently this last week, that they are manufacturing and they are also now exporting their ammunition to Sudan. And it's where the UAE has a strong connection to. It's a way to which they can legitimize their presence as part of to suit different audiences in terms of a counter-Russian narrative or in terms of a counter-US narrative. That's where I'm going to leave it for now. But the greater the chaos, the greater the instability, the more that they seem to thrive in this regard, and the more that they're bringing in further external partners. It's a trend that is worsening. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ajiz, for your presentation. Now I will give the floor to Waslan Al-Tayeb. Perhaps I didn't make any mistake in your name. So it's okay. So he's he's a Dutch Sudanese national who was held hostage by the Rapid Support Forces and will share a first-hand account of the atrocity committed. So, Mr. Tayeb, the floor is yours.
Next one.
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I am one of the first victims in this war. I was captured in the first week, actually the fourth day of the start of the war. In the time that I spent with the RSF, I did witness all sorts of the crimes that you heard of. So firsthand, because I don't know why, but I was treated different than the rest of the people. I did suffer at the beginning of my captivity. But after that, I was kept with their intelligence. So I had to go through witnessing all the crimes that you heard, from murders to tortures to rape, all of it. I was witness to. But in the same time, the war in Sudan started physically in 2023, but it started before that time, ago, that like the fifth generation wars, and putting Sudan in a certain narrative that is a country that is constantly in war and starvation and so on. It made Sudan in a certain narrative. And that narrative carried on, which is increased the suffering of the people now in the war itself. Because it's removed highlighting the real criminals, the RSF and their backers in the United Arab Emirates, which is orchestrated and backed and commanded this war all the way by, for example, stating it's the war, as an example, the war is between the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces. It is not between the RSF and the Sudanese armed forces. It is between the RSF and Sudan as a country. The people fighting in the ground right now is the Sudanese armed forces, the police, intelligence, and the Sudanese civilians who took arms and joined the army as group fighting against the RSF. And that is very important because by stating it is between the SAF and the RSF, it made it like equal oppositions, and it actually misguided the whole narrative. That is, what is the war is about? Sudan is a state, is a very old state, one of the oldest nations on earth, but still being treated like a war between two forces. It is not. Between the central government led by the command of the army, because we are in transition, because we are in a change of government. And there is a civilian government that needs to be led by a civilian prime minister until we have an election. Right now, before we have this session, we've been discussing about that for the last 5 years, we don't have high courts. We don't have the constitutional court in place. And that is one of the pillars of the civilian government, or of a governance in any country. So these kind of pillars does not exist. And at the same time, the international community being pushing the same narrative that is actually is a war between two armed forces. It is not like that. The country of Sudan, it's the whole plan is to hijack the whole country for resources, for political gains, and it's being supported by, we have one of the things that we're suffering in Sudan from is our political parties or political groups. They don't distinguish the line between political actions and where they can have a political debate, or they can attack the government politically and attacking the country itself. So we have politicians. I used to be part of these groups when we are opposing the Bashir regime, that they don't shy out to lie on the government just to make something up, just to prove that there is a corrupt government. There is corruption. It used to be some corruptions. Nobody can deny that. But in a way that actually put hands or hide the crimes which is happening on the ground, that is another crime by itself. Supporting the UAE to try to cover up the crimes committed in their land in Sudan, that's a crime by itself. We have over 12.5 million. That's the last statistic, which it was 2024, I believe. 12.5 million displaced people. Displaced means it's not just people they fled their place. No, they lost everything. They lost their position. They lost all their earning that they used to have for the years. They've been working hard to make their houses, their cars, everything is being looted and is transformed west, either to Darfur or to Chad and Niger further. We have over 100, the last year statistics, over 150,000 people, these are the people who were being murdered in the fighting, not by bombing only. Even that's the killing, people who was being killed. The last statistics, which is over 10,000 women being raped. There was a rape televised in the CNN and the BBC of a woman in the beginning of the war. And still, the action is being so little because the narrative is wrong. The international community is not interested of the war because it's misclassified maybe, or the money of the UAE is being acted as one of the barriers for the media or for the, we have very very small group of journalists really focused, like Oscar, focused in what's going on in Sudan. And his colleagues in the Middle East Eye is one of the first news agencies that is actually picked up what's going on. But other than that, then you have the Guardian. You have the very small group of journalists taking up what's going on, which when it is one of the, it's not one of, it is the biggest crisis in the modern age. We're talking about 12 million and a half is being displaced. We're talking about over 150,000, that is what is last year was said, over 10,000 women being raped, that is what is being taken account of. Keep in mind, Sudanese people are conservative people. There is a lot of rape being not documented. They don't talk about. I know of people that women, they did commit suicide just to keep that from being known outside. We have hundreds or tens of thousands of girls, and nobody's talking about these girls being taken from Khartoum, from Al Jazeera, and taken to Darfur and to the neighboring countries to be used as sex slaves or to be traded, sold like slaves. Nobody's talking about that. And this is proven. It is still, right now it does exist, and it is in Niala right now. If any organization is like to go and investigate it, they will find it. That is, and it's for well-known families that they actually, they've been taken. But the reason of all this happening is the lack of interest of the international community in shedding the light in the real perpetrators, who is committing these atrocities, who is backing it up. One of the things also, the people they do fall wrongfully on is equalizing the Sudanese government seeking support from Egypt, which is the ancient country. This is Egypt as a very close country to Sudan for centuries. Sudan and Egypt is one of the oldest countries on earth. It's over 1,000 years ago. So it's normal that Sudan seeks help by Egypt. It's normal Sudan seeks help from allies and friends. What's not normal is other countries supporting a militia to destabilize the country itself, or to destabilize or to commit the atrocities the RSF committed in Sudan. The RSF is being classified as a criminal group since 2003. It's not 23, it's 2003, when they used to be called the Geneva. Sorry, I just took longer than I'm supposed to. And thank you very much for attending and listening. And I give the floor for questioning.
Thank you. Sorry, I have just a technical issue with the Zoom because I don't have on so I will still to. I don't have the connection with the room camera and the laptop, so I'm going to try to get in like this. Okay, can you hear us? Okay, sorry, we have an issue with system here, so People will be able to hear you, but will not be able to see you. So I will present you shortly, and you will see how we can fix that. So Sudan's branches of the Genocide Convention. So you will join us online, and so now the floor is yours.
That is slaughtering of civilians, that is raiding that is exactly what we're facing today. I can name starting from the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972, moving on to for sure the peace agreement in 1997, to comprehensive peace agreement in 2005, the Abuja peace agreement, CERT peace agreement, the Doha peace agreement, the Juba peace agreement, and even the interim period, transitional period, right? It was a really mere sort of a settlement between the military and the civilian leaders, and so those are kind of reasons why we failed to address the political crisis. So this war was inevitable, and I think the only something that we did not expect was the magnitude and from where it started, right? And it started from Khartoum. That was surprising for a lot of people. Now, swiftly on to the current violations and the war that we've done, and they're all political center. And I think in the months preceding the atrocities, particularly those committed in Geneva, we've been raising concerns about the imminent risk of atrocities and genocide. And this is not only because of the very recent history, I'm speaking of, 2 decades ago, the history of genocide and atrocities by the same groups, same perpetrators, and same ethnic groups who was represented in Arabs, and in the same region, right? Darfur, here speak. The reason why I'm mentioning Darfur, the focus of our investigation is because when the conflict started, particularly in Darfur, people were attacked on ethnically motivated grounds, right? So basically, the RSF, their allied militias, made their plans clear, and that is to destroy the Arab populations in Darfur. And you will see that from some of the incitement languages that they have used, and we documented that. For example, they say, shoot the boys, and the boys. For example, we would not leave any educated Sunday alive will finish you. Those are kind of things that they would say. They would write on the walls, shops, and this is the land of Arab, this is not the land of Sunday. And we must destroy the more basic kind of language that was used by the RSF in days preceding the atrocities inside Nigeria. So, what next? The atrocities that we have seen so horrific. It's not only the atrocities themselves, right? But it is they were preventable, right? We have, a lot of people have documented that already. Information was made available. The international community was aware, and there were tools available to prevent. But they failed to do so, and I think I really believe that that was deliberate in the sense that how can you know that the atrocities will come in, and you were seeing the early indications, including by the UN itself, and yet they failed to act. And so, on our part, just to amplify the concerns, the risks, we sort of write leading international jurists and prosecutors and scholars to sound the alarm. That was from 2023, and then 2024 we started sort of investigating whether the possibility of whether genocide has occurred or not, and we reached 5 definitive conclusions, and we used 2 sort of standards of rules, reasonable amount of belief, and clear atrocities in West Darfur, targeting particularly the mineral saline, killing thousands of them, and systematic attacks. This type of sort of language that was used. There is no other conclusion than saying that the RSF intended to destroy the saline all or in part. That is what we decided. And then we also concluded that based on clear, convincing evidence that the RSF and allied militias have committed, and actually today still committing direct public incitement to genocide in Sudan on social media platforms, on their Telegram channels, and with the statements of their affiliates, their group, and other sort of militias, field commanders and the like. And based on these two primary conclusions, we also concluded that based on clear, convincing evidence that the UAE, as the speakers before me already elucidated, and Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, and Russia, and the Wagner Group have, or they're complicit in the atrocities and genocide committed by the RSF. That is in direct contravention with Article 3E of the Genocide Convention. And based on these conclusions, of course, we believe that all 153 states parties to Genocide Convention are obligated to end complicity and employ all means reasonably available to them to prevent and halt genocide. This is an international obligation, it's a duty that should have been honored. And I think they have, states parties, all state parties, because the Convention of the National Committee as a whole, have the duty to end complicity, to prevent and punish, the perpetrators of the genocide. And then finally, there's a reasonable ground to believe that the RSF and allied militia are responsible for genocide against non-Arab groups other than the Masalin, including the Fur and Zagawa, and this is primarily in Central and North Darfur. And actually, this report was released in April 2024, and just a couple of months later, we've seen targeted attacks against Zagawa, for example, in North Darfur. Dozens of villages have been attacked, systematically attacked. The attack on some IDP camp last April, and the numerous incidents that we have already seen coming, and that is the reason why at the time when we released the report, we've seen based on reasons that the RSF was going to, was responsible for genocide against, potential genocide against, other non-African groups other than themselves. And so because of these conclusions, and as the theory of change, and I'll conclude in a minute or so, we feel the way to end the atrocities not only in Darfur but across the country is by targeting the enablers of the warring parties and enablers of these atrocities. Right? You can target individuals in the RSF or individuals in SAF, but that is unlikely to end the violations and the atrocities. And I believe that the reason why these atrocities are continuing until today, and of course the war continues until today, is because the warring parties, and here is not only SAF and the RSF, there are many warring parties, and of course their supporters, they continue to work because that is one of the reasons why at the center we convened and we established a convened task force. And the idea of this task force is primarily to survey different accountability forums to hold the states and entities accountable for the violations. That includes the ICJ, perhaps domestic prosecution, universal jurisdiction, and the like. I'm happy to speak more further when if there's a time, but I think this is just to lay a foundation as to what we think will be helpful to respond to these atrocities. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, just in time. And we so people were able to audience were able to see you and to listen to you. And thank you for the participation. And we have a few minutes for one or two questions with the audience. One question, so just to tell you, just a question, because we have 4 minutes, so just one question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Muhammad Yassin from the African Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies. Thank you for this panel, and to my friend Dr. Murtazam. It is good that you highlighted that the RSF is not committing genocide only from 2023, but goes back to 2003. But I would like also to highlight to you that the genocide is not even goes back to 2003, but goes from 1983, when the rebellion started in South Sudan before its secession. And don't you think that now you are condemning only RSF? Don't you think that also RSF is a genesis, it is an embryonic creature of the South? And don't you think that all these mushrooming militias are coming from the Muslim Brotherhood and the political Islam which want to dominate in Sudan? If you have a highlight on this matter, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
So I'm sorry. You will have time outside the room to speak with the speaker, because we are just in time to finish. We have a schedule by 5 it should be finished. So thank you for the question, and for sure the speakers there will be very happy to answer your question outside the room. So sorry for that, and thank you all of you for attending to our side event, and that will end the side event for today.